Welcome to the Fighting on Film podcast, the podcast all about classic and obscure war movies, from the Normandy landings to the days of chivalry and swords. If it's been captured on film, we're going to try and cover it. I'm Robbie of RM Military History.
I'm Matthew Moss of Historical Firearms and the Armourer's Bench.
Hello and welcome back to Fighting on Film. This week we're pleased to be joined by the host of the Cold War channel on YouTube, David Schroeder. And keeping within his area of expertise, we're going all the way back to 1955 with that Cold War bomber fest that is Strategic Air Command. David, we're thrilled to have you on. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me on, guys.
It's our pleasure. It's our pleasure.
So, David, the first question we always ask, especially when people come on and they've picked the film, when did you first see Strategic Air Command?
So I think the first time that I ever watched this movie, I was maybe 12 or 13 years old. We had just moved. My family, we had just moved into a new town, new city, new country. So didn't know anybody and looking to occupy my time with movies, whatnot. And I'm an old guy, so the selection at the time, it's not like it was, you can go on and stream whatever I want. So it was a very limited selection that we had. And Strategic Air Command was one of those, and popped it in and sort of lost myself in the clouds for quite literally for about 2 hours. And the movie's really stuck with me since.
It really does have that old Hollywood style and the sort of, you're in safe hands, shall we say, when you watch it. The Technicolor, the stars, it's just something about it is so of its era.
It's a big production film. Certainly, I mean, cooperation with the United States Air Force. So it's got all the bells and whistles that 1955 could offer for a movie. The story's definitely written with a message. Like, there's the scripting and everything is designed around selling the United States Air Force and, its position during the Cold War. It's certainly not a B movie, no. Which I know you guys have watched your fair share of. So
yeah,
if this goes well, I'm invited back. Maybe we'll pick something a little more lowbrow next time. So
sure thing. Matt, when did you first see it?
I think it's one of those Saturday afternoon matinee what's on TV type deals, and I think I may have watched it with my granddad. I watched a lot of war movies with my granddad. Again, as David said, it kind of stuck with me. I fondly remember it, but I don't think I'd actually watched it again until we knew we were going to do it for this episode. So I sat down and I thought, this is aged really well in my mind anyway. I enjoyed it and it kept me enthralled. Although it's not technically, a combat war movie, which we're not opposed to covering things that aren't actually fighting on film, because it's a Cold War movie and that's what makes it so interesting. And although it's peacetime, they're on a wartime footing. And I love Jimmy Stewart, so it's a win.
I mean, come on. I mean, Jimmy Stewart is one of those classic actors, isn't he? But for me, I'd never heard of this movie. I mean, I heard of Jimmy Stewart, obviously, A Wonderful Life. It's a Christmas staple, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And I was really excited to see it because when me and David were talking over Twitter DMs to plan the episode, he was like, "It's a baseball film with bombers in it." And I went in and I was like, "Oh wow, I'm going to see Jimmy Stewart hit a home run." And like I thought he'd join up to fight in the Korean War. So I was like, someone would rush into the stadium and be like, "The Koreans have, oh my gosh, we're going to go fight the Koreans," sort of thing. And that didn't happen. There was no baseball, but I absolutely loved it. I'd happily watch it again. Stewart really sells the movie for me. If it was anyone else, I think it'd be maybe a hard watch in places, but he's so charismatic and likable.
Yeah, his charisma and background really sell it.
They really do.
He was the Hollywood actor at the time. That was you couldn't cast anybody better. I mean, he was a B-24 pilot during the war, 20 combat missions over Europe. He stayed in the Air Force Reserve afterward. He actually, I think he retired as a brigadier general.
He did.
Yeah.
Flying for Strategic Air Command.
When you've had a career that runs straight from the B-24 Liberator through to the B-52, then there's no one better to make a movie about Strategic Air Command, is there? And he doesn't need to learn about how the US Air Force operates at that period because he knows he's a member. He's in the club. He's the perfect man for this. He's not only money at the box office in terms of Hollywood, He's also very experienced, and he's kind of playing himself almost.
Very much so. Yeah.
I mean, he just knocked John Wayne off the top spot for the number one actor in Hollywood at the time. So he was huge. But, the guy had won a Croix de Guerre in the Second World War. He got a DFC. Absolutely incredible in terms of his military career. And then, he goes on to have this incredible acting career after. He also worked in Hollywood during the war, and he was in Winning Your Wings that was directed by John Huston. I see him as like a David Niven type actor. They're just eternally charming. There's something about their way on camera that it just makes them watchable.
Yeah, he has like an everyman's charisma.
That's it.
Yeah, I mean, God, he's been in so many films. The Glenn Miller Story, which was also directed by Anthony Mann, who directed this movie. Men in War.
Yeah, Men in War.
Was also directed by Anthony Mann. So there's another little connection.
Wow.
And of course, he was a telemark as well. So Anthony Mann knows how to do a war movie, that's for sure.
He's the man.
But yeah, Jimmy Stewart's career is insane when you look at it.
Yeah.
Dozens and dozens and dozens of movies. Most of them are classics, in my opinion. So Jimmy Stewart plays Dutch Holland. He's obviously the lead, but the supporting cast is pretty interesting. So we got June Allison, who plays Sally Holland, his wife. And she was also his wife in the Glenn Miller Story. Then you've got Frank Lovejoy as General Hawks, who was in Retreat Hell and Beachhead in a couple of years before this movie was made. And he plays this sort of Curtis LeMay character, which I'm sure we'll come back to talking about later on.
Yep.
We've got Bruce Bennett, who was an Olympic shot putter turned actor.
Amazing.
Which is a crazy career. And then he was in the Navy during the war. He's Major General Spy, who brings back into the Air Force. Then we have Harry Morgan, who plays the flight engineer on the B-36. Obviously, perhaps best known as Colonel Potter from MASH. He was also in a 1960 movie, Jimmy Stewart's only other World War II movie, Mountain Road. But yeah, that's you got Jay Flippin as Tom Dolan, the manager of the St. Louis Cardinals.
He was in Winchester 73 with James Stewart as well, so there's a bit of connection there too.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I think, did Mann direct Winchester 73?
I think he might have.
That. Yeah. So I think that's about it for the cast. I can't.
It's a very lean film in terms of cast. I mean,
you can only fit so many people into a B-36.
That's true. Yeah,
30 or 40 at most. So
yeah. I mean, production-wise, as we said, full cooperation from the US Air Force, which was something that was done at the time. Famously, Men in War didn't get any Army cooperation.
Yeah, which is interesting, and that's a couple of years after making this movie.
Yeah, exactly. And the St. Louis Cardinals gave full cooperation as well to the movie. So, and they were in their summer training camp in Florida, at the Owl Lang ground.
Sports trivia.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, who knew on a film pod? It brings me into my next point that the story though is inspired by Ted Williams, who played for the Boston Red Sox. And obviously, maybe David probably be better to talk about baseball than a British person would be. But
I'll be honest, I'm probably actually better to talk football with you guys than I am for any North American sport.
Oh gosh. But yeah, so he played for the Boston Red Sox, and he was just coming into the major leagues. World War II happened. This is a potted history. Sorry to any Americans listening. I'm probably going to butcher his backstory. But from what I gathered, he, big star, goes and fights in the Second World War, flying in the Marine Corps, comes back to the majors. There's nothing this guy can't do, like an all-star, World Series. But then he goes and fights in Korea. There's definite beats to real life there. And I possibly maybe think that Ted Williams was still a big star in 55, so maybe it was difficult. It would have been difficult to maybe get the rights to use his likeness, possibly.
Perhaps so, and obviously because they wanted to make a SAC, Strategic Air Command movie as well. They couldn't use him verbatim. He would have made a great movie for the Marine Corps, that's for sure.
It would have done, yeah. But it led to a 25% increase in recruitment drive for the Air Force, this movie. So it did its job.
That's wild, because when you watch it, everyone's like, I hate being in the Air Force. It's too hard, and I don't like it, and I want to go home. And why I've fought in World War II, and I've been called back, and I don't want to be. I just set up a television business. I was doing electricals, damn it. And now I'm
Yeah,
here like being a navigator on a B-36 and I want to go home. Then it leads to an increase in recruitment numbers. That's wild.
it's crazy, isn't it? But
That's
it's
something we'll probably come back to, but I think it's really interesting the way the tone of the men that it portrays. It's quite, it's quite authentic and realistic in that, it's not showing them all going, gee, I love being in SAC. It's just the best.
yeah,
I love
yeah,
being prepared to drop nuclear bombs on the enemy 24 hours a day.
SAC had a real reputation, even within the Air Force, for being an incredibly difficult branch, like Major Command, to be a part of. A lot of that was driven by, just to go into a bit of the history here, a lot of that was driven by LeMay. Certainly, it was all about rules and regulations, lots of reward to go with it. And it almost sounds like I'm talking to the script, because there's pieces of that script like almost verbatim,
Yeah.
where it's like, we work hard and we play hard kind of stuff.
It's like we promote, and if you mess up, then you get demoted.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's all very, it's very realistic. It's very true to the spirit of, in this day and age, like the corporate culture that SAC built from the late 40s into the 50s. In terms of the tone the movie sets for recruitment, I mean, obviously what came to mind for me was Top Gun. Put yourselves on the line, like, it's like live hard, play hard, big rewards, like fly the jet, get the woman,
Yeah.
etc.
yeah.
This has more of a 50s feel, and there's no beach volleyball, but that's
Shame. I'd love to see Jimmy Stewart play beach volleyball. That'd be great. Jimmy Stewart and Harry Morgan playing beach volleyball. God, that'd be a hell of a film.
I would love to have heard Danger Zone start when he's flying some B-47s. That would have been great.
But by a swing band.
Yo, my eyes, Dutch. That's probably what it would say. So it's filmed in VistaVision. At the time, was a brand new format to film 35mm film stock in. So it expanded the screen, sharpened the images.
Definition.
Definition, that's the word. And it is used beautifully by the cinematographer William H. Daniels, who worked on Jimmy Stewart films like Winchester 73. And he just uses it to perfection to show these aircraft taking off in the air. There's brilliant model work that gets brought in for some external shots of the aircraft, but just for aerial sequences in a movie, they're just...
Some of it's pure porn, really, isn't it? Let's be honest.
Yeah.
It's just literal aviation porn at some points. There's sections that go on entirely too long. It's not the cinematography that makes you go, God, this is going on a bit too long. It's the main theme of the movie, which is one of the sticking points for me. That main theme gets overused way too much, I think, to me. But some of that cinematography, where it's the B-36 is climbing and weaving through cloud banks and stuff, it's really gorgeous. And
it is beautiful.
That vivid color of VistaVision is just stunning.
A lot of the B-36 footage from this movie is some of the only actual film footage of the B-36 that existed. Like once the program, the B-36 program wrapped up and the planes were decommissioned.
Yeah, they were starting to phase them out not too long after the film came out, right?
1959, the last airframe was decommissioned. So
wow, that's fast when you think about it. Wow, that kind of puts into perspective, doesn't it? How fast technology was moving, because it's the B-36 is a sort of a hybrid. It's a prop and a jet powered bomber, and they are huge.
Yeah, they're massive.
You don't really get an idea of the scale of those in the movie. They should have put like next to like a B-24 or something, or B-29. That would have given you a real perspective of how much bigger the B-36 is.
The one thing that really struck me in terms of how they put some of the scenes together, like on the airfields, was that you only really ever saw single airframes. There was not a lot of mixing. Like there wasn't ever scenes where you saw B-36s and B-47s together.
Yeah.
You didn't even really see any other type of jets on the jetways or anything. It was always single type airframes that were there, which I thought was really interesting. It wasn't even that there was rows of cargo planes, or it's like I would have expected to see C-74s or KC-50s or something else, other frames on the tarmac, and that was never the case. And I have to believe that was very intentional. in terms of those overt displays of power that sort of the Air Force is obviously wanting to show.
Definitely. I mean, when you think about what is shown in the movie, there's what is it that refuels them? It's a KC.
At that point,
there's a plane that refuels the B-47 in there, which is a great scene.
It's a KC-90. It's a KC-94.
But even that is shown as a truly like mammoth aircraft.
Yeah, huge. Yeah.
So perhaps it's just a pure piece of power projection onto screen, where we've got the big stuff, lads, and we'll use it if we have to.
I hearken it back to when we covered the Ministry of Information film Miss Grant Goes to the Door. This will make sense, but the Home Guard are really overly powered in that movie, overarmed, tooled up for what they actually had in the May of 1940 in that movie.
Yeah, for sure.
And we said in the episode that surely that's to do with this movie's going to be played everywhere in the States. It got UK showing too. You don't know if there's any. I mean, this is really sort of conspiracy theory-esque, but if a double agent goes to see this movie, he can't report back to his handlers, "Oh, look, they're using old aircraft. We'll be fine. Oh my gosh, look at what they've got to use against us." It's this sort of propaganda power.
I guarantee there would have been a file on this movie in the Kremlin somewhere.
Has to be, yeah,
because it's exactly the sort of thing that they profiled and kept tabs on. And they wanted to know what the Americans were doing propaganda-wise, just as the Americans were aware of what the Russians were doing propaganda-wise. So you're exactly right.
Go to see the latest Jimmy Stewart film. We need to see Big Bomber. You document, you come back. Just
a big bowl of kasha while he's sitting in the theater.
Yeah. Every week, well, every other week, I try and get a retro review. And I got a good one from The Sketch. And this is from the 29th of June, 1955. So they give it a little rundown of the plot. So it's a super colossal recruiting poster for the US Air Force, clearly designed to excite young men of America and the maidens who influence them with the prospect of joining SAC and operating one of these gleaming modern bombers which gulp up space in enormous swallows. Along with the impressive documentation goes to a slight story about a baseball star who has just married and settled into a new home when he is recalled into the Air Force, which needs men of maturity and experience to operate the new B-36s and B-47s. James Stewart and June Allison are pleasant people to have about the screen, and they have so much practice playing husband and wife that their mutual scenes are very plausible. The film is in VistaVision, which shows off the air shots to the advantage, and is an example of what large screen techniques can do. It must be regarded as one of the best.
We should have just read that and ended the podcast there, shouldn't we, really? Because that's it, isn't it? That's the plot. They've clocked immediately that it's a propaganda movie.
As that review said, it's the guy's playing baseball for the St. Louis Cardinals, and he sees a B-36 fly over. General Hawk turns up and is like...
Chekhov's B-36, just sorry.
Yeah. And he's like, "I want you to come and fly bombers for me." And Dutch goes, "Sure, why not?"
Well, no, he's a little bit reluctant. Let's give him his due. So
tiny bit of reluctance.
Yeah. So the general comes and visits at the practice field, and he's like, I need to talk to you. And then they have a lovely chat at his housewarming, and he ruins his housewarming for him because Jimmy Stewart's on $70,000 a year at the Cardinals. He's big money. Like, he's the Michael Jordan of baseball in 1955. It's
adjusted
insane.
For inflation, that's almost like $700 million or something.
Yeah.
I read. Yeah.
And then the US Air Force recalls him, and the general's like, "Oh, I'm sorry I made you take that reserve commission.
Yeah.
I'm going to have to ruin your baseball career for 2 years." It's an interesting movie because it's such a picture of the idyllic 1950s USA, isn't it? June Allison is literally introduced as a vicar's daughter. So Jimmy Stewart as Dutch is marrying a vicar's daughter. He's playing baseball, all American boy, playing the baseball, making all that money playing baseball, which is the American dream.
Yeah.
And then he's a veteran. He's been in the Air Force, U.S. Army Air Force, previously. And then he gets recalled, and the spanner in the works is he has to go and fulfill his duty because he's still a reserve officer.
Yeah.
And he's never flown a jet before, never seen a B-36 other than the ones that keep flying over the practice field.
Yeah.
And so he's reluctant at first, but as soon as he sort of slots back into the regime of SAC, he enjoys the pressure. He loves flying, and I think that's what really sort of draws him back into being in the Air Force. He loves flying. From there on, it's sort of a steady plot of towards him wanting to remain in the Air Force rather than leave after the 2 years. There's a little bit of jeopardy where his B-36 crashes, and then he's introduced to the new B-47, and he falls even further in love with flying because it's the new hotness, it's the new cool aircraft.
All the cool kids are flying the B-47.
Exactly.
It's the most beautiful jet I've ever seen.
Yeah. Oh, it's the most beautiful jet I've ever seen. It's just like, you know.
Oh my God, I'm so envious of your Jimmy Stewart impression. That's so good.
It's not great.
It's not Dana Carvey level of good.
No, it's not. But I'm sure we'll hear it again. But for me, I mean, to jump in there, for me, I feel that Stewart is the government and his wife is everyone else. Because he buys the rhetoric, he sort of buys the propaganda halfway through when he's got the option to go back and play, you know, to return to his old life. And he goes back to June and says, look, you know, we're preparing for a war that it's not being fought, but it is being fought, and we have to be ready for it. We have to be prepared for a war that might come. And she's like, oh, but you're not at war. There's no problem. And he's sort of trying to explain that, you know, there's a reason behind what he's doing. And then he goes back and flies, and she's just sort of in bewilderment at why he wants to do it. And that scene for me is where it really becomes like backseat propaganda, because then it's sort of trying to say to the people in the cinema, like, look, you know, we had a big war, we don't want another one, and this is why guys are having to do what he's doing. And I can totally, I can totally see why it works as a propaganda piece. From that
she bends over backwards at first, doesn't she? You know, and it shows their private life somewhat. You know, she has a baby. Yeah. In between smoking 20 packs. She has a baby. She has got
one of the most 20-a-day accents going.
Yeah, she has got the huskiest voice, and she's great in the movie. Like she's really
fantastic,
like. Yeah, she really sells the part, and you feel for it because she can't control the fact that Jimmy Stewart's been drawn back into the military, and he loves flying. She just wants to go back to that life that she thought she was going to have, because it's idyllic at the beginning. It really is. Like
it is, but she's the smartest one in the room. Because he's given up 70k a year to go and fly B-36s. I agree with you, June. Like, cut the guy's legs off or something. Keep the money. It's like, what the heck? But, you know, I totally understand as well from Dutch's side of why he wants to go and do it.
The propaganda pieces, while the general is explaining what SAC's role is, like in the Air Force, it's and trying to, you know, basically bring Dutch on board. When he is reluctant at first, it's the one line that actually I even bothered to write it down because it really stood out. We're the only thing that's keeping the peace. It's a very general, like Curtis LeMay line, but it sort of underlines that whole we're at war, just nobody else knows it. This is the only thing that's keeping the peace and preventing. Our massive retaliatory force is the only thing that's preventing us from dropping atomic bombs. Yeah. And if someone wants to pick out the irony from that, then please go ahead.
Yeah, there's a whole 2 minutes worth of exposition, isn't there, to the manager of the St. Louis Cardinals. And he's almost like selling the idea of SAC to the manager of the St. Louis Cardinals. And the guy's just stood there like, okay.
Yeah.
You know, because he's not going to be joining SAC, is he? He's just like...
He just wants a third baseman.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I'm playing the Cubs next week. You don't understand, Hawk, you know. It's almost like the anti-war game. I think it's endemic of some of these early Cold War films before you get the war game, when they're quite jingoistic. The fact that A-bombs could destroy everything is sort of just not important. It's like, yeah, you know, we're flying these bombers and they can go really far. But Don't ask what the payload is or anything like that. Let's just skirt over that bit.
They mention atomic bombs in the movie once. They never mention Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It's basically like the entire B-29 force in the Pacific and 10,000 men. Like they give it this real massive weight of numbers. The word atomic bomb is only used in the movie one time.
It's a really important thing to sort of make people aware of, and then the fact that this Hollywood movie, this massive production Hollywood movie, is just choosing not to say anything about a possible war. And I maybe think because Korea's only 2 years old, maybe people are a bit war weary. For a movie about bombers, to not mention any bombs is really weird.
The hydrogen bombs had just started being tested within 2 years of the film as well.
Right.
So there's definitely like a lot of growing fears and concerns surrounding H-bomb effects and the devastation that that's caused, because it's on such a greater scale. And the B-36 and the B-47 were, I mean, the B-4, those were the H-bomb delivery systems in 1955. That was the only means of transporting that to a target, let's say. So I can certainly look at it now, looking back at it, I can understand why they would want to downplay that as in a propaganda film anyways.
Well, yeah. You don't want to tell the public the truth. I mean, the War Game tried that and it got banned, so...
Right.
But yeah, I mean, let's not get bogged down in nuclear apocalypses. Not when the bombs look that good, guys. So I think maybe that brings us on to the alley tally.
It's time for Alley Tally on Fighting on Film.
So, David, you're the guest this week. You get to go first. What's your alley?
I think a lot of times, like, the alley tends to be sort of the more like smaller things. I went for the real big boy in the room. The B-36 to me is just sort of this,
of course, yeah,
this phenomenal, incredible piece of hardware, machinery. Like it's not pretty. There's other prettier jets. The B-47 is much prettier, but that B-36, it's for those who out there who might not be familiar with it, it's just this big gigantic aluminum cigar shape with gigantic wings, 6 pusher propeller engines, and 4 jet engines on it. So a lot of times you'll hear people refer to the B-36 as 6 turn and 4 burning, referring to the engines. But it's just this massive piece of technology that, when it was introduced, it was already obsolete. Air technology was advancing so rapidly as it moved from propeller into the jet age, and just with development times on jets and aircraft in general, like it was obsolete when it was introduced. And yet that's what the US Air Force had as their primary sort of bomber weapon. And by God, this movie was going to sell it to the best of their absolute capability. And to me, they did such a great job of selling it as this wonderful, wonderful piece of hardware, and just selling it almost as a character unto itself. So I love that B-36. I think it's an absolutely incredible looking machine. It was in service for about 10 years, never once dropped a bomb on anything in anger.
Good.
Yeah, good thing.
Exactly.
I think, as beautiful as it is in that brilliant cinematography externally, like the interior shots really fascinated me, where Harry Morgan, Flight Master Sergeant Bible, I think his name is, and he shows him around the aircraft during that first flight on there, and taking him through the tunnel into the back, and he meets all the guys at the back there on the guns and in the navigator's position, etc. Just really fascinating. Like there's a coffee machine, and it's just the scale of the thing, and for a fact that you haven't seen like half of that thing. You haven't seen the bomb bay for one, because they're not going to show you the bomb bay, just in case any Russians are watching. And it's just it staggered me. I thought, this is really cool that they've gone to the lengths of mocking up the internals and showing us parts of the aircraft. And It really gives you an idea of the scale and the capability of the airplane.
Like, even with there's a crash scene. I think at one point, what Jimmy Stewart, there's an engine fire, which apparently wasn't that uncommon in the B-36. There's this crash scene, and even with the crash, it sort of shows that there's a resilience and a ruggedness to this. That the B-36 crashes in Greenland, and they crash, and my navigator's got a broken angle, but it's fine because we're sitting here making hot coffee, and we just put a blanket over the one of the gun portals.
Yeah.
And everything's fine inside there.
Yeah.
We're toasty and warm, and it was just missing the marshmallows. That's really sort of the impression that you got from how they were filming this. They went to the ends of the earth to sell that B-36 as a wonderful, fantastic machine. So,
as Matt was saying, it shows the scale perfectly. There's a little clip where I think it's one of the ground crew is just sort of seeing them off, and the wing goes above him. Shows the scale of that thing so well. It's just, I couldn't fathom, because you see pictures, and Matt sent me a picture of comparing the sizes of the bombers, and you sort of still don't get the scale. And then when the guy was standing next to it, I was just like, oh my God, human beings made that. We went from biplanes in the 1900s, early 1900s. 50 years later, we're building a B-36, then a B-47, just after the Second World War and all the sort of destruction and material losses that we'd had and all things like that. It's getting a bit grand, but humanity designed something like that off the scale.
Yeah, it's hard to comprehend, really, when you really think about it.
Yeah.
Especially, and it's literally a projection of American might on screen, isn't it? Having that huge airplane as the main star, other than Jimmy Stewart, of course.
He really should have second billing.
Yeah, second. Yeah, the B-36 and James Stewart. Yeah.
There's a number of other films that do a similar sort of thing for other elements of the Air Force, because this worked so well. I think they did a showing off various parts of the Air Force. Cinema is such an effective medium for showing this kind of thing because it can show the real scale of a bomber. Other than being in front of one, you can't really get an idea of what they're capable of, other than in this kind of medium.
If you're a Cold War plane spotter, this is the movie. It just has to be.
It really is phenomenal. I mean, they've taken so much care and time to make sure that they get the perfect angle shots, so even getting the lighting right, making sure that you get there's never, that I recall, there's never really scenes with clear blue sky. It's always blue sky with big puffy cumulus clouds as the death machine pushes its way through the air. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, that's what they were.
Yeah.
B-36 entered development in 1940, 1941, when the Americans knew that they were going to be entering the war, but it looked like the UK might not survive, might be subject to a British invasion, and they needed a truly intercontinental range bomber that they could support an attack on Germany with from the US, from the American continent. And even while the war was going on and they were sinking massive resources into the B-29, Convair was pushing all this time and effort and resource into this B-36 project. The American government gave it funding before there were even prototypes built. They'd agreed to order 100 before they'd even gotten one off the ground to do evaluations on it. By the time that they actually by the time that they first flew, the hydrogen or the atomic bombs had already been dropped on Japan. And that sort of set a slightly different trajectory as to what the B-36 was going to do and the role that it was going to fill. But it came into service with underpowered engines, which is how the jet engines got added to it. It's this phenomenal, crazy story of technology so quickly outpacing the development of the product. It's missing the duct tape and the WD-40 to keep things moving there, but that's really sort of the feeling that you get when you read about the actual production of the development of the B-36. That they're just adding pieces to it to try to keep up. with the technology as it advances. But it really is just this phenomenal piece of alley.
So Matt, I know you might have picked the B-47, so jumping off from the B-36.
Yeah, and it kind of ties into my favorite scene as well, which is
Sure.
when it's introduced. But yeah, the B-47, what an amazing aircraft, and again, relatively short lifespan. Much like the 36, I think it survived into the mid 70s as a test bed for certain things, and as a reconnaissance plane as well, sort of. But as a frontline bomber, it was only in there, I think, maybe 10, 12 years, if that. It's such a different aircraft to the 36 because it's kind of filling that medium-sized aircraft role. So they're seeing that they're going to be equipped with, rather than atomic weapons, they're going to be equipped with hydrogen weapons. And they've improved the engine technology, so it's a smaller aircraft. The crew as well is a fraction of the size of a B-36's crew. So there's a navigator and two pilots on board, I think, on a B-47. It's obviously been designed around speed. Speed is its main defense. I think it only has some tail guns rather than the numerous guns that the 36 has, and it's designed to be capable of evading enemy interceptors. So it's a completely different aircraft in terms of genesis of the idea, the concept behind it, and it fascinates me that they were trying these various different things, and it was probably in development just as the B-36 was reaching its fruition and it was beginning to be introduced. It's just the way that at that period aircraft were being developed in such rapid succession has always fascinated me. It's the same with fighters. Things were coming into service, as David said earlier, things were coming into service and they were already more or less obsolete. And it's just incredible that America had that capability of not only developing these aircraft, but sustaining that kind of broad loss of effort that they poured millions of dollars into these programs, and their industrial might is such that they can shrug off the fact that this thing's only going to be in service like a decade if it's lucky.
Yeah.
So it's an incredible thing. And it's just a gorgeous aircraft. It's the lines of the B-47 have always struck me as being like that classic medium-sized, streamlined, swept wing bomber.
It's very 50s design, isn't it? It looks like something out of a sci-fi serial at the time.
Even just the all aluminum, like the non-painted aluminum feel to it, like it's because as soon as you get to like the 60s in Vietnam, where it's the Southeast Asia camo patterns, and so I think that's how the U.S. Air Force actually balances things out. They design a couple of bombers, they stay in service for 10, and then they design the B-52, which stays in service for 70 years. So
yeah, I mean, it's a thing that's still ongoing. Look at the F-22. That was a relative failure, but a huge amount of money was poured into it, and they learned so much from it. And the F-35 is probably going to be in service 2, 3, 4 times as long as the 22 is. It's just those sequences of when it was taking off and landing, and it deploys, the drag shoots out the back, and you've got the crew communicating, especially during the climactic ending where Jimmy Stewart can't move his arm, spoilers, and the co-pilot has to sort of operate the throttles for him. Just really interesting in the way that it combined not only the external sort of cinematography of showing the aircraft in motion, but also with I like the sequences where the crew is working together, and they edit that together really nicely, so it flows in this sort of way where you get this impression of professionalism. The navigator is having a little joke like, well, 30 seconds early, or owe you $5, or those kind of little bits within the movie are really nice little things that break up not only the shots of the planes in flight, but also the serious sort of propaganda tone that it has in other parts of the movie. And my other rally pick is the very briefly seen, because I have to mention it, is the very briefly seen revolver on Jimmy Stewart's hip during the briefing scene. They're about to fly to Japan, and as he returns to his seat to sit back down, he turns, and just on his hip he has a Smith & Wesson revolver. Only gun in the whole film, so I had to mention it.
Out of curiosity, was it an M15?
I think so. Yeah, I think so. They came in the late 40s. I think the M15 came in. The model that the M15 was, the commercial model that it's based on, entered production in 46, 47. So I think it'll have been an M15. So the dog handlers were the last people in the US Air Force. The dog handlers from the MPs, or the Air Base Security Forces, I think they're called, were the last people to carry revolvers in the US Air Force.
Well, there you go.
The reason that I asked that question, I was, as one does, I was looking at through various pictures from SAC bases earlier today, and there was one of a staff sergeant in the Air Guard, and he's got a big Colt 45 strapped to his hip, and of course it's you're sitting there looking at it, and it's like that. I'm pretty sure that's not standard issue. That's certainly not an M15 like a strap to his hip, and it's just this gigantic hand cannon attached to him.
I don't know what the issue sort of was for whether you got a 1911 or an M15.
I know M15 was standard issue for SAC from early 50s, I want to say, but I don't know where they stood in terms of non-reg like sidearms and whatnot. But
yeah, I don't know. The US Air Force is an interesting one because obviously, famously, they were the first US service branch to adopt the M16.
Curtis LeMay was the guy that introduced AR-15s, the Armalites, into service specifically for his base guards.
Yeah,
that was, and he started that whole process of what eventually turned into the M16s that I'm sure were so loved by people on the ground in Vietnam. So
it's a shame there's no little sequence of Jimmy Stewart firing his revolver on a little range, sort of getting reacquainted, because that would have been a nice little callback to his Western roles.
Yeah,
if he sort of tried to fire it like a cowboy, and someone's, "Oh, you're not in the movies. Fire it the right way." Yeah, that would have been quite a nice little nod.
Do you know what I did like about that? It's kind of like that. He arrives on base. They hold him at the front gate because he hasn't got his ID yet, because he's just returning to active duty, and he's not in uniform. And the general arrives at the gate, which is very well timed. He
amazingly well timed.
Yeah,
it's almost like it's a film.
And he lets him in, and
the script.
And he's like, "Why aren't you in uniform?" And Jimmy Stewart replies, "Well, it was the wrong color," which I really like that line. That was a great little thing to include, because obviously the U.S. Army Air Force, when it became the U.S. Air Force, changed color from khaki to Air Force blue.
Because doesn't he say to him something like, "Oh, I see you're not in your blues"?
Yeah, it's when Hawks is introduced. That's a great scene, actually. We should mention that, because he's taken onto the base and he's being shown around a little bit, and then this commercial aircraft has to land. It's in trouble, and it lands, and they clear the runway, and it lands, and then a load of guys just pour out of it, and you're like, "What the hell is going on?" And then General Hawks steps off, and he's like, "This was a test." All of the airbase guards are sort of embarrassed. I don't know why the commander of the security detail is like, "I'm sorry, sir, I should have been more prepared." Well, like, you rounded them all up before they even got off the runway.
Yeah, it's unfair.
Curtis LeMay, obviously, who Hawks is a dead ringer for, he used to do things like that at all of his bases globally. He would, wouldn't file a flight plan, would fly into the base, ask to see the base commander, and do a full surprise inspection. People commanders would lose their commands. Security staff would, be demoted.
Yeah.
That's very much based out of that corporate culture of fear that LeMay sort of instilled into SAC. That line, I think there's one line that Hawks gives in response to the security chief. It's all I'm interested in is results.
Yeah.
Don't tell me. It's basically, don't tell me about your HR problems. All I'm interested in is results.
Yeah, because he says his men are too green, doesn't he?
It's such a great caricature of who LeMay represents.
It's really interesting that they did that, because obviously LeMay must have had a big hand in the movie. So it's interesting that they had someone portray him so closely. I would love to have been in the production meeting for that, where he was like, yeah, he's got to chomp on a cigar for like the whole thing.
They even make a joke about that when Hutch, Jimmy Stewart, finds out that he's a father, and like, you know, it's like, and takes the cigar that's given to him, and this one's for the general. Like that's
yeah.
for that.
He gets off the plane, doesn't he? And there's like a ground crew, and he's like, "Doesn't the general know that plane's cabin's pressurized? That the cigar could make it explode?"
Yeah.
And Jimmy Stewart goes, "It wouldn't dare."
Yeah,
it wouldn't
it's a
dare.
great little line.
I love it. I'll quickly do my alley. It's just two really small points. I really like James Stewart's USAF navy bomber jacket that he wears. Just think it looks great. Bomber jackets are cool. And then he has some actual genuine alley, and we rarely ever get any genuine alley, where when he starts flying the B-36's long haul, especially when the crash happens, he's wearing his St. Louis Cardinals hat, his little baseball cap, which I just think is really, really nice little touch.
Yeah, and it perfectly fits the traditional original definition of alley. It's non-issue cool gear.
Fave scenes. So, David, again, you'd like to start us off?
My favorite scene, that's one that's stuck with me since I first saw the movie. When Jimmy Stewart Dutch is doing his first B-36 flight, he's told that he's going to do one takeoff, one landing in the B-36, and you know, his wife's, you know, has dropped him off at the gate, right next to the B-36, which I think is absolutely hilarious because, you know, it's supposed to be the most secure base in the world.
She gets around. She just walks into the operations building at one point. She's like, General, I need to speak to my husband. Well, he's like, well, he's just gone.
Well, she later in the film, she has new mother energy, and you were not going to stop a new mother going anywhere.
Very true.
If you know what's good
true.
for you.
Yeah.
So maybe that's why.
Privileges of the colonel's wife, I think. So that's
yeah, definitely.
But so she, you know, his wife drops him off, like, you know, he's going to do one takeoff, one landing in the B-36. She's going to wait for him at the gate, and you know, he gets in, and they go through the huge long pre-flight checklists, and it's, I mean, in a movie that you would think is trying to, like, you know, sell everything as being like, you know, look how instant everything is.
Yeah,
they really take their time sort of looking at the checklists, which was another big strategic air command factor.
Yeah, exactly. They're trying to show the safety factors and everything that goes into making this a slick operation.
It's another LeMay thing. When he was a commander in the Second World War, he found that he was losing too many pilots to accidents, and he found that it's because there wasn't standardized checklists. So first thing he did was roll out standardized checklists, and he did that when he came into SAC as well. So it's just sort of all these little callbacks to, you know, the LeMay touch, like, you know, what he really did in the organization. But they take all the time, they go through all the checklists and everything, and they take off, and Jimmy Stewart does the whole, like, it's like, well, you know, it's like, aren't we a little high for a landing pattern? Like, you know, 40,000 feet. And it's like, you know, it's like, yeah, like, you know, it's like we're doing, you know, one routine mission, and it's from, you know, Dallas Fort Worth at Carswell Air Force Base to Alaska and back, which in a B-36 is that's a long flight, and it's just the whole laughter, and you know, it's, you know, somebody tells him that, like, somebody will tell his wife that he's not going to be back for a while, and that scene just always made me, it stuck with me.
Go
just
have
sort of
his massage and rub down, which is
when he gets back, right?
Yeah, and he's as surprised about that as the audience probably is. He's like, what?
Yeah, but that scene just sort of stuck with me, that it's this casual, like, oh, we're just going to do one takeoff and one landing with a flight from Texas to Alaska and back. So
because that's like the first part of the movie that really starts to hit home the propaganda side of it, where it's like, this plane can go that far on one tank. Even the sort of bits that you don't really think are propaganda, they kind of are. So when they go to the back of the plane to showcase the gunners, just to show that it's got some armament, and that little. I think the coffee line of being like, oh, James Stewart's like, oh, cup of coffee, and then he's like, oh yeah, we'll get your cup in a minute. And I always think, well, there's a reason to that because they want to show that these guys are well looked after, even in the air. They're going to get a hot cup of Joe, something to eat.
Yeah.
They are going to be well looked after, and it's just trying to sort of subtly say to anyone who's maybe thinking about signing up, it's like, look, not only is the bomber really brand new and amazing, but we take care of our guys. This is why joining the Air Force is cool. This is why it's a good thing to do.
They do the same thing in one of the B-47 scenes when they're flying, when the navigator comes up and gives them a sandwich.
Oh yeah.
It's this whole it's like this might be a smaller jet and all this, but here we're still gonna feed you and we're still gonna give you coffee and make sure that you're looked after.
Yeah.
As one of the crew. So.
Even if it does come from a thermos instead of a coffee machine.
Not nicely ground,
Yeah.
So Matt, your fave scene this week?
Yeah, mine kind of plays into my my alley choice as well. So it's that first scene where Jimmy Stewart and General Hawks, General Hawks shows Jimmy Stewart the B-47. So it's after the crash, and I think they're on the way back, and the general is giving him a lift because he's just had a baby, and they're refueling, and the general just says, I've got something to show you, and he leads him over to this huge hangar, and it's kind of like he opens the door, and it's sort of it's a bit of a Ark of the Covenant moment where it's just expands into this big hangar, and then right there, lovely, really nicely framed shot of a B-47, and they walk up to it, and the camera's sort of like a quarter overhead shot, and it shows them walking up to it, and Jimmy Stewart's like just in awe of this brand new aircraft, and he's going about how beautiful it is, and the general it explains a little bit about the aircraft, and he's kind of like, he says, maybe you'll get to fly one, and then they leave the hangar, and goes back home and sees his baby. And it's just a really short scene, but it's that really nice introduction to the next generation of SAC aircraft. Really cool scene.
And there's the sort of the over the head, so the aerial shot of it showing the wingspan, and another scene where they show the scale of an aircraft with people, and and as I said earlier, it's the scene that cements Dutch back in the ways of the Air Force. He really wants to fly it, and that's the main conflict comes from the film with him and June, where they, she's like, what are you doing? Well, you got to do this, and he's like, but it's a B-47. It's the most beautiful plane I've ever seen. I have to fly it. Yeah. I think it's quite interesting in this movie that somehow the antagonists of the aircraft as well. It's just a really interesting film in that regard. But no, the B-47, it just looks incredible, doesn't it?
It does. And in filmmaking terms, it's really interesting because they have that challenge of going from, wow, giant B-36 to smaller but better.
Yeah.
Sort of B-47. And they have to sort of convey that in cinematic terms. And I think that scene does it really well. It highlights that it's sleek, new, fast. Stewart's reaction to the actually seeing the plane is what gives you the sort of, okay, so this is going to be the next big thing. That's the sort of scene that cements the B-47 is the new star of the movie now.
That scene where they sort of show the B-47, I think one of my favorite little pieces from that, where there's sort of that attention to detail. The General Hawks' his transport plane has it's got a 4-star flag painted on the fuselage just below the cockpit. Unless you know what you're looking at, it's an absolute throwaway, but it's just that little tiny add to detail that, it's anybody who's flag rank, it doesn't matter what your vehicle is, if it's a car, if it's, even the transport, they've bothered to look at that and put the 4 stars on the plane. It's quite a nice little touch there. So
for me, it's the crash scene. It's the set piece, the only I say only set piece, but it's possibly
lovely model work.
Beautiful model work. So there's a crash. They're flying the B-36 long haul. They're over Greenland, and one of the engines fails, and it sets alight.
They're testing fuel tanks, aren't they?
That's it. Yeah.
Cold weather fuel tanks.
Cold weather fuel tanks, yeah. And there's a fire starts, and Dutch goes through his procedures and things, and then it looks like they're not going to be able to not crash. It's going to go down. So Dutch courageously lets all the guys bail, and you think he's going to bail, but oh no, because he's a hero, he stays in the cockpit to try and keep it, glide it down. And his is it his radio operator that stays behind?
It's his navigator.
Navigator.
Yeah, and I think it's David probably knows better than I do. It's like a
it's
dual role, is it?
That's his navigator. It's the guy that he pulled from the original crew that was going to get demoted out. So
that's it.
So he jumps on the radio, doesn't he? So
yeah.
He jumps on the radio.
That's not traditionally the navigator's job, though, is it?
Yeah, exactly.
Because they would have had a radio guy.
So that you get these really, I love the shot of the guys after they've bailed, because they're just clearly little stick figures animated falling out the sky. And I did laugh quite a bit at that. But my laughter was abated very quickly, because when the crash actually happens, you get this really nice model sequence of it crashing, and the wings come off, and it just shows a B-36 sled as it becomes going, ploughing into the snow. And it's just really atmospheric. You've got the tension of, is Dutch going to be killed? And then you get that lovely shot of him in the cockpit with all the snow coming in. And it's just really well done. And there is genuine jeopardy there, because, you're pretty sure that the crew that bailed, God knows where they are, even if they've survived. You've got I thought it would turn into like a survival film, perhaps. I thought maybe that was going to be the shift, but it didn't. But there was a little bit of it where it shows the two sort of having a nice cup of coffee, as you said earlier, plugging the little hole with a sleeping bag, or an emergency sleeping bag or something. And then luckily they get found in a couple of days, and it's all hunky dory. But as we said before, it's showing. Look at the survivability of a B-36, lads. If you get shot down, or if you have to do this, then you're going to be just fine. There's candles, there's mess tins full of hot cocoa. It's a man's life in the USAF.
It's interesting that they show the fallibility of the aircraft, I thought.
I wasn't expecting them to do it. I thought he'd perfectly land it, maybe to show to subvert the fact that a plane is.
Yeah, well, I mean, as David said earlier, it shows the strength of the fuselage of the plane. That it doesn't fold up and completely, collapse and kill them both.
No, that is true. It
holds together, and it's fine American engineering. It holds together, and they're alive inside. But I just thought that was really interesting that they decided to show the fallibility of the aircraft from a perspective that did happen.
The crash itself is actually based on a real life incident that happened. A few years, 1953, I want to say, it was a B-36 coming into Newfoundland, Goose Bay, I think, CFB Goose Bay, and engine fire, and the crew bailed out. Pilot brought it down, and he survived the crash, etc. So I mean, they've lifted sort of from the pages of history to the silver screen type thing.
That's nice. It really works. I think it's I think they should have ended the movie on that. Whereas they should have had the B-47 bit maybe earlier if they could have done it that way, because I feel that's a lot more of a tense situation for him to be in. Will he get back to his newborn daughter and his wife? Will they survive the cold? Rather than, poor old Dutch has got a hurty arm. He can't land
There's
the
no
jet.
jeopardy to that scene whatsoever.
No.
You watch that scene where they're, don't worry, the single fire is still burning. Do you want to top up? Don't worry. Can you put that back in the hole? Yeah. It's getting a bit drafty in here, Dutch.
You almost
So he does.
expect like Jimmy Stewart to pull out a cigarette and go, "Someone light this for me, so I can down this plane." It's just like there's
zero jeopardy. Even once they've landed, and is the Air Force going to find them? It's just like, yeah, of course they're going to find them. Next thing you know, there's someone digging outside, and like, oh,
hello,
it's Harry Morgan. You want to lift?
Yeah,
it's just,
and I think another thing where in those scenes as well that really would have helped it. There's no turbulence in any of these sequences, even when he's going down. It's can they not have some lads shaking the set or something to give Stuart something to act off, because he's
it's interesting because he'd have known what landing a plane was like.
Yeah.
He'd have known there would have been turbulence, and he should have been like going like bouncing around in his chair. But they don't do that. It just must have like slipped their mind.
I suspect that's maybe the Air Force's involvement, possibly, tap on the shoulder to the film crew, being like, you can't, won't let you do this,
It's completely fine that the plane's crashed, but my God, if you show them having a rocky ride when it's happening, don't go that far.
And
it's like driving an American car. You'll be comfortable when it breaks down.
Exactly. So. Yeah.
I've got in my notes here that the chap that crash is based on was actually on site at Carswell Air Force Base during the filming as a consultant.
Oh wow!
And his name was Brigadier General Schufler. And he was on an Arctic B-36 mission that David mentioned, and it did crash.
Wow.
So he was the consultant on the movie, which I think is really interesting.
I think we might come on to final thoughts. What do you think?
One last little sort of like tidbit on this movie. When it premiered in 1955, it actually premiered at SAC headquarters outside. Like SAC headquarters is off at Air Force Base, Omaha, Nebraska, and that's where they chose to, rightly so. That's where they chose to actually do the premiere of the film. Big, huge. I mean, this is a big AAA Hollywood film, showcasing and premiere in Omaha, Nebraska. And Curtis LeMay attended, and his wife and his family attended the actual opening gala, hosted the party afterwards.
Wow.
LeMay was infamous for absolutely hating social gatherings, but that's part of the more brass you have on your uniform, the more that type of thing you have to do. But he attended and hosted the opening of it and everything. So I thought that was just one of those little nods to the involvement of the Air Force in the movie. Was that
that's really cool.
It even premiered at Offutt. So
that's great.
That must be the only major film that's had a premiere in Nebraska.
I can't imagine that there are too many others.
No, probably not.
What a great piece of trivia.
That's great.
That's cool.
And all of my reading on LeMay, I've never been able to find any quotes from LeMay on what his thoughts were regarding the premiere, but that's as I read more, I'm sure I will hopefully find something. So
I love the film Hate the Pie. Probably that's probably
yeah.
I want to say thank you guys for letting me come on and sort of talk about a movie that I really do enjoy. It sort of has a bunch of those check marks about the Cold War stuff that I am always fascinated by. It's airplanes, and Jimmy Stewart's always a pretty good bet on any kind of day. I really like this movie because it's outside of what you guys normally do, but it's sort of showcasing that idea that the Cold War there wasn't direct fighting between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, but there was this undercurrent and low current of constant hostility and tension that could at any point spill over. And I think that the movie does a really great job of sort of encapsulating that and presenting that as this is why the U.S. Air Force does what they do, and they're there to defend America. And one day, if I ever get really into Soviet cinema, I hope I can find sort of the equivalent piece to this that sort of shows.
That'd be great.
A bunch of guys standing outside of a Tu-95 thinking that they've got to watch for Jimmy Stewart coming over. So
I saw a pleasure for having you on and talking about the film, but I think this is the power of the war movie genre, is that, as we've seen and as we will go on to see in the podcast run, like these movies are really important for historical context, because this shows a part of the war, part of the Cold War that is really important, part of aviation history that's really important, showing that everyone was sort of willing and prepared to come back into the fold should the need have arisen. it shows how important the war movie genre can be as a piece of propaganda cinema. It's very interesting from that point of view, and the ending sequence where Hawks, I really like the line where Hawks is like, "Look, I've campaigned for better bedding. I've campaigned for more time off to get the best guys and keep the best guys." And I really like that because for me, it was a nice little ending line for him because it wasn't only just saying, please come and join the Air Force. It was thanking the men who were already in and giving up their time, like thanking the men that were already serving. I thought that was a really nice little touch of the movie. And the theme song's an absolute banger.
Although it gets a little overused in some of those aerial sequences, the main theme.
I got the lyrics of the song here.
Oh, do treat us to a couple of the lines, Rob, please.
I watched it with subtitles and found myself singing along. So
all this week when I've been watching it with my wife, I've been like pumping the air as it's coming on, and I think it's called. I don't know if this has an actual. It might be called Masters of the Air or Men of the Air or something. The actual track, but it's bombers high, right in the air. Every man doing his share. Men of war, better beware when the Air Force takes command. It's just so like rabble rousing and gets you up off your feet. It's such a great song, and the end shot of the movie is absolutely fantastic. Where you see the squadron of B-47s flying off into the distance, and it's just like when the Air Force makes the man.
Great shot.
And it's just like, come on,
It's exactly what the film wanted you to feel when you saw that.
Exactly.
It's that propagandic sort of element to it where Rob was about to go and join SAC because he saw Jimmy Stewart fly a B-47. And
this is my whole point.
That's the power of the film.
I think you would. I think if you were of that era and you saw something like this and you were even half interested, I think you'd at least go and check what it was. You'd at least go and see what life could be like in the Air Force for you.
Yeah, well, this film was successful enough to, as you mentioned earlier, it boosted recruitment by 25%. And the Air Force did it again in 57. They did B-52 Command.
Yeah.
Or I think it's called B-52 or Bombers B-52. I'm not sure. I can't quite remember. Which had, I think, Carl Malden in. And then there was a Rock Hudson movie a couple of years later, which just goes to show that they're taking leading actors of the day and they're putting them into these roles and trying to make these films to encourage people, the average American cinema goer, to go, damn, I want to join the Air Force.
And also just does it with a respect for the men that they're already doing the job, and it doesn't forget them either. It's not just trying to be like, we need more new people. For
me, I think the film is very much of its time. Pacing is a little slow in the middle. For me, for once, it's me complaining about the pacing, not Rob.
Rare.
It's just the nature of this kind of film, and obviously they can't have too much jeopardy in there because of, again, the nature of the propaganda and what it's trying to portray. But I really enjoyed the movie. I think those scenes of the aircraft in flight are absolutely stunning.
Yeah,
I can't emphasize that enough, and that's probably my favorite part of the movie is those scenes where we're seeing these aircraft that are long grounded, they'll never fly again, in flight doing what they did, being the deterrent, the nuclear deterrent that was there to prevent a nuclear war that probably would have ended civilization as we know it.
Yeah.
And bonus, we get Jimmy Stewart in a great role, and he does a great job of portraying this patriotic, all-American, duty-bound flyer that is willing to sacrifice a really successful baseball career to protect, the American way of life, which is exactly what SAC wanted to instill in the men that were part of the command. They wanted guys to be willing to do these long hours, the really demanding jobs that they all had. And yeah, it's a really interesting movie, and it gives us a window into how SAC operated and the propaganda of the period. It's a really interesting film.
If you enjoyed listening to me talk about Strategic Air Command and SAC, please make sure that come check out my YouTube channel. It's the Cold War channel. We've got I'm somewhere in the middle of a very long episode on the rise of Strategic Air Command and General LeMay, and lots of things that sort of touch on this movie. And now that I've done this podcast, you guys are definitely going to get a pretty big shout out in the actual episode
Oh,
as
thank
well.
you.
So thank you guys. Like this has been a lot of fun. Like I've really been looking forward to this, and
So have we.
it's a ton of fun.
It's just nice to cover a film that isn't, this episode might as well be called Flying on Film for 1 week. It's just nice to cover a war film that deals with a different aspects of war. That's one of the reasons we set up the pod. It's the jumping off point. And as David has said, if you are interested in this, David's Cold War channel is an absolute smorgasbord of Cold War content, and you really can't go wrong. I also would say, if you don't listen to it, Cold War Conversations as well, to get your earbuds and your eyes into. So again, thanks for listening. We've really enjoyed having David on. No doubt we'll invite him back, because there are some really good Cold War movies that we can cover. And as always, don't forget to share the podcast, leave a like, a review on whatever podcast app you're listening on. Do check out the website, fightingonfilm.com. Check out David's channel, Cold War channel, on YouTube. And you can support the podcast on Patreon. And yeah, thanks for listening, everyone, and we'll catch you again. So bye-bye.
Thanks, guys. Bye.